Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And today we're going to go back to 1993 and 1994, respectively, as we take a look at the first two records by Bay Area punk rock revivalists, Rancid. Now, Rancid were formed in Berkeley, California in 1991 by Matt Freeman and Tim Armstrong. I think it's safe to say that Rancid were formed out of the ashes of Freeman and Armstrong's previous band, Operation Ivy, a band which broke up in 1989. Now, it's very well documented that during that window of time between the demise of Operation Ivy and the birth of Rancid, that Rancid singer Tim Armstrong fell into a deep state of despair. He fell victim to his own alcohol and substance abuse, and at one point in time actually became homeless on the streets of Oakland and Berkeley. Now, some people have suggested that Matt Freeman came up with Rancid as a brainchild in order to save his friend Tim Armstrong. Now, whether or not that is all true or not is all part of the urban legend and the folklore that surrounds this band. But one thing that I think is undeniable is that this band would eventually become one of the most important bands to come out of the Bay Area during the 80s and 90s scene. Most important, definitely. Best, in my opinion, I would say no. For those of you who have paid attention to this channel, I think you could guess which I would say was the best band to come out of the Bay Area from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. If you're somebody who has not paid attention to this channel, good on you. I don't know why you would. But in case you haven't, let me give you a hint as to who I think was the best band to come out of the Bay Area from the mid-80s to the mid-1990s. There's a little hint for you. That being said, I am a huge fan of this band, and I have been going all the way back to very near the beginning. I don't know that I would necessarily, claim to be an OG when it comes to Rancid, but if I'm not, I am definitely very close. This is a band that I discovered on the first record one weekend, sitting at home while I was in high school, doing my usual weekend routine, which was watching 120 Minutes on MTV. Now, back in those days, 120 Minutes was still being hosted by Louis Largent. This was before, Matt Pinfield took over as the host of 120 Minutes. Actually, sadly, Louis Largent just passed away not too long ago. And I always take these things hard when these musicians or certain celebrities that I have a connection with pass away, but Louis Largent was somebody that turned me on to so many great bands just through his hosting of 120 Minutes. I was actually quite saddened when I found out that Louis Largent passed away, but I do remember distinctly one weekend watching 120 Minutes, and at the beginning of each show they would kind of give a rundown of some of the bands that they would be showing videos of that week. Now, I don't know, I can't speak for you, but for me, 120 Minutes was just something I never missed. It was appointment television as far as I was concerned. Sadly, I didn't have any other plans on most weekends when I was in high school, so I was pretty much glued to the television every Sunday night for 120 Minutes. And at the beginning of this particular episode, I remember Louis Largent saying, "And we have a video from a band called Rancid coming up," and a band I'd never heard of at the time. And I immediately sort of recoiled at the band's name at first. I thought, that's sort of a dumb name for a band. Why would a band call themselves Rancid? I just don't get it. And as the show went on, after every commercial break, he would come back in. They would drop the names of some of the videos coming up, and he would always say, coming up later in the show, we have a video by a band called Rancid. And by the end of the show, I was just so intrigued as to who is this band? Why would they name themselves Rancid? That's such a silly name for a band. Now that we're 30 years into the band's career, I actually think that the name Rancid is a great band name. It fits them rather well, I would say. I've always been a fan of the one-word band names. But anyway, at some point during the show, they eventually, towards the end of the show, they do break into the song Hyena, off of Rancid's 1993 self-titled record, and I was just immediately drawn to it. There was something about it that I had never seen before. Now, I believe I've mentioned to you on this channel in the past, I grew up in a very small town in the mountains of Northern California. There was no sort of grit or urbanness to my hometown at all. But there was something about this video that I had never seen before. I had never really heard a band that sounded like this before. I had never seen a music video that was so sort of low-budget, gritty DIY. And there was just something about it that really connected to me almost immediately. Now, at this point in my life, as far as my musical fandom goes, I had begun listening to a little bit of punk rock, as far as my very, very infancy into the genre. I had begun listening to bands like the Dead Milkmen and the Butthole Surfers. I had discovered Rollins by this point in time, and through Rollins I had discovered Black Flag. But I had still never heard anything like this, and like I said, the first time I saw that music video, it was something I'd never seen, and when I discovered that this band was from the Bay Area, that definitely threw them some points, at least in my opinion, being from Northern California. So I remember at one of my next conveniences, I ran down to my local Tower Records, which was in the next town over from me, a town called Chico, California. And I was able to find this record on CD, and I remember the first thing I was drawn to was the album art. To me, this was something that was very gritty at the time. I loved the artwork. I mean, this was definitely not the Dead Milkmen, son. I loved the logo. I loved the graffiti sort of stenciled logo. And to me, the first song I ever heard was the song Hyena, which to me is a very gritty, urban type of song. I think that was something about it that appealed to me because I was somebody who grew up in a very small town, and even though I was living in a very small town, I'd always felt in my heart that I was very much an urbanite. So there was just something about this album cover that struck me. It was like, this is gritty, this is like hardcore, this is something that's, like I said, this is not exactly the Dead Milkmen. And of course it has the picture of the three guys on this record on the back. Of course I recognized them from the video I had seen on 120 Minutes. One thing I used to do back in those days also was I would always video record every episode of 120 Minutes, and I had a few of these VHS tapes lying around my bedroom most of the time, and this was one that I went back and I watched this Hyena video on high demand, and when it first came out I was so drawn to it. And I remember when I bought this record the first time, it was something that I felt like it was a little bit musically out of my comfort zone. Now at this point in time I was still ignorant to the fact that there was really this whole scene of bands in the Bay Area. Like I said, I lived in a very small town that was very sort of removed from anything urban, or I guess you could say this time sort of cutting edge. So to me, I was completely ignorant of most of these bands. I don't even think I discovered Green Day until after I discovered Rancid, because I don't think I discovered Green Day until the Dookie video, which I think came out after I had purchased this record. But this is a record that, of course, this record features Tim Armstrong on guitar and vocals, Matt Freeman on bass and vocals, and drummer Brett Reed. Of course, this is the only record in the catalog which does not feature Lars Fredriksson. Lars Fredriksson would join the band after the record was released. He actually joined the band on this first tour. Now, I did not have an opportunity to see this tour. The first time I saw the band live was on the Let's Go tour in 1994. My best friend Tim and I Went to go see Rancid on the Let's Go tour. This was my first show. I've seen Rancid just a ton of times at this point in time, but the first time I saw Rancid was on the Let's Go tour in 1994 at a venue called the El Dorado Saloon in Sacramento, California. Now, the El Dorado Saloon, at least this incarnation of it, has been gone forever, but the place was just a pit in like the best way possible. But ironically, it was sort of funny because it was in this sort of strip mall. Now, if you're familiar with Sacramento, I mean, a lot of Sacramento is in strip malls, and I'm not saying that to throw rocks. It's just not, necessarily the most urban big city in the country. But the El Dorado Saloon was a place that was just scuzzy in all the right ways, and that was the first time I ever went there. Was the time I went to see Rancid. I went to the El Dorado Saloon a couple other times after that. I saw the Stiff Little Fingers at the El Dorado Saloon, and I also saw a band called the Ocean Blue, which was sort of a weird band for that venue because the Ocean Blue were always a little bit more, indie. And it was funny, when the Ocean Blue came out on stage, they almost looked like guys who would have met at like some Ivy League school, and the place was very scuzzy. I remember when I saw Rancid the first time, a band called the Swinging Utters opened for them. Now, if you're from the Bay Area or Northern California, you've probably seen the Swinging Utters a million times. I mean, this is a band that opens for every single show throughout the Bay Area. And I got to be honest with you, man, the Swinging Utters is a band that I just do not understand. I never have. From this time seeing the band live in 1994 with Rancid to now, this is a band I've never liked. I don't understand why they're so popular. Apart from the fact that they are a Bay Area band, this is a band I've seen probably, over 10 times over the years, playing at various shows throughout the Bay Area. To me, they sucked in 1994, and they suck now. And I'm not saying that, to be unfashionable or start any sort of, bicker with you if you happen to be a fan of them. I don't get it. In fact, the last time I saw the Swinging Utters was not that long ago in San Francisco, right before COVID, more or less. I went to go see Lagwagon play in San Francisco, and the Swinging Utters opened for them. And now I knew what I was getting into with the Swinging Utters because they are a band that I've never liked, and they're a band I've seen a bunch of times. But, I was like, all right, they're playing with Lagwagon, that's fine. I definitely wanted to see Lagwagon. That's a band I've liked for a long time. But the Swinging Utters came out, and they just played forever and ever and ever, and it was like never ending. And like I said, this band I just don't like. So eventually I got frustrated and I left before Lagwagon even came out on stage. You can probably see my friend Gizmo right here. She's joining me today. She's feeling a little anxious and codependent, so she's hanging out with us today. She is a huge Rancid fan also. But anyway, I do remember going to see Rancid live at the El Dorado Saloon in Sacramento with my best friend Tim. And for me, this show was just one of those situations in my life that was completely life-altering. I walked out of that show a different person than I walked into it. I remember after the sort of lackluster performance by Swinging Utters, Rancid came out. And at this point in time, I was a huge fan of the band. Still am, but I was a very huge fan of the band at the time. I was really into the Let's Go record, which was still relatively new at the time. And the band came out and started playing, and I just completely, lost myself in that show. The band came out, and I remember feeling for the first time in my life that I had really found my community. And, this was one of the first times I'd ever really been to a quote-unquote, underground punk show. Like I said, I grew up in a small town. At this point in time, I was living in a town called Chico. I was going to school up there. Now, Chico had a little bit more, of an urban experience to partake in at the time, but it was nothing compared to living in a place like, Sacramento, or eventually when I moved to the Bay Area in 1997. But that show, seeing Rancid on the Let's Go tour in Sacramento, to me was completely life-altering. Like I said, I drove home that night, and my friend Tim and I drove home that night to Chico from Sacramento, and looking back on it, I sort of feel bad for him because I was just physically vibrating. I was so excited. I was so, I can't even put into words the way I felt. It was something that, like I said, I felt like I had found a piece of myself that I had been looking for. And, my friend Tim, I think he enjoyed the show enough. He's never been the biggest punk rock guy. And I was probably talking a million miles an hour. I was so excited. We had to drive home 2 hours to Chico. By the time we got home, he probably wanted to wring my neck, and, sort of understandably. But anyway, the first song on this first record is a song called Adina. I really do like this song a lot. By the way, this record came out on May 10th, 1993. It is produced by Donnell Cameron, and of course it is on Epitaph Records. The first song is a song called Adina, a song that I do really like. This song features something that I think is a little bit too prominent on the first record, and I don't say this out of any form of disrespect, because I think that Matt Freeman is one of the greatest bass players in the history of this scene, and that's not even an opinion, man. That's like a fact. I mean, Matt Freeman is just simply one of the greatest bass players in the history of this scene. But as a vocalist, man, he's somebody that I've always sort of had an issue with his vocals. Now, I'm not saying that he is this, but to me, his vocals have just always been a little bit too growly, almost a little bit too death metal-y. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that he is death metal, but it's a little bit too much in that direction for me. To me, he's always sounded a little bit cartoony. Now, if you're somebody who enjoys death metal, I mean, I don't understand why. It's not a genre of music that I've ever really completely understood. Now, I went through a phase back in probably the late 2000s where I was hanging out with a friend of mine in Seattle. And my friend, he was like the Rush guy. He was obsessed with Rush. Probably the most obsessed with a band person I've ever met in my life. I mean, this guy was just, Rush 24 hours a day. And he and I hung out a lot back in those days. And usually what we would do is we had the same weekend. So we would start out, we'd go out and get some drinks somewhere. And then we would usually get a 12-er. And we would end up back at his house listening to records and talking about music. And eventually, of course, he would start playing me, the newest Rush, bootleg that he had just discovered. And we'd end up, usually 9 times out of 10, we'd end up discussing Rush because that was like his entire life. But apart from Rush, the guy loved anything that was technical or proggy. He also loved Dream Theater. I've talked about the story on this channel where I went to go see Dream Theater with him, but he loved anything that was technical. He loved death metal. He loved grindcore. And through the duration of our friendship, which lasted a few years, really until my next move, I began going to a lot of metal shows with him. It was something that he enjoyed. I enjoyed hanging out with him, and it was something that I thought I would give a chance. Now, to me, it's, I'm just not a big metal guy. I really never have been. But especially when you get into that sort of extreme metal, it really isn't music that does much for me at all. And in particular, the vocals. And I know that that's probably the most generic opinion, about death metal that you could have. But I just cannot get past the growly vocals. I think it's silly. I don't think it sounds scary. I think you sound like a fucking nerd. And I'm a nerd, so if I think you sound like a nerd, you got some issues there, son. I mean, I understand that, it's part of the musical aesthetic, and it's, one of the defining characteristics of the genre, and I get that you're trying to sound scary, and ooh, no, but it's just never really done anything for me. And to me, Matt Freeman, like I said, I'm not saying he's a death metal vocalist, I'm not saying his vocals are that extreme, but I've never liked his vocals, and to me they sound a little bit cartoony. I think on this record, if I have an issue with this record in its entirety, it'd be that there's just a little bit too much Matt Freeman's vocals on it. That's just my opinion. I still think he's probably the greatest bass player, at least in this era, in the history of the scene. Apart from that, the song really paints sort of a grim picture of, urban existence. And like I said, especially on the first record, these first two Rancid records in particular, to me that was such a big appeal of it. Was, like I said, I grew up in a very small town. I yearned for this. I longed for this. I loved hearing these songs, hearing these stories. I always pictured myself, even when I was living up in the, the safety and the relative tranquility of the mountains. I always wanted this. I always wanted to be riding the subway and, in the grittiness of urban alleys. I always loved that. And this song paints sort of a very grim picture of that. The next song is Hyena, the first song I ever heard of the band, the song that turned me on to the band, that spawned my fandom, if you will. A great bass solo sort of starts this song off. Not like the first song, Adina. This song is basically about street life. I think the character in this song, is very nihilistic. Feels as though he has nothing to lose. In today's musical culture, this kind of reminds me of a lot of the bands that my wife listens to, bands like Lost Dog Street Band, Littlefoot, guys like that. Lyrically, this song reminds me of those bands. Now, I would take Rancid over both of those bands, but my wife and I have gotten in the habit over the past few years, of going to the Muddy Roots Music Festival out here in Cookeville, Tennessee. And a lot of those sort of alt-country hobo punk, Lost Dog Street Band, Sin City, Bridge City Sinners, bands like that, they all kind of have lyrics that remind me of this song. Now, I would take Rancid, of course, every day over any of those bands. The third song on the record is Detroit, another great bass solo. I picture this song being about the band's first, or one of their first trips to Detroit, and shenanigans ensue, as you might expect from Tim Armstrong in his younger days. I remember the first time I ever went to Detroit was probably in 2003. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I had a friend who was in a band in Chicago, and they allowed me to ride up to Detroit with them one night. They were getting to play a show, as they were getting ready to play a show up in Detroit. It was the first time. I've only been to Detroit a couple times, but it was my first time going to Detroit, and we got up there early, and I remember we decided to drive around the city. Now, in 2003, Detroit was in a much scuzzier state than it is today. I know Detroit has, for some reason, has elected to try to attract a lot of the tech industry into their city, which to me is always the death toll, as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand why people want to attract more of these soulless, techies into their city. It seems like a very lazy way to revitalize your town. But I remember my friends and I were driving around Detroit. We got there super early, and it was pretty beat up back in those days. We definitely ended up in a couple neighborhoods that would definitely make your butthole pucker. And I'm somebody who had spent a considerable amount of time living in Oakland in the 90s, and I can tell you that the first time I ever went to Detroit was like nothing I'd ever seen. Last time I went to Detroit, and it's been a long time since I've been to Detroit, you could see that there was a real, the city had really made a lot of progress, if you will. But I'm a huge fan of towns like that. I mean, my favorite city in the world is Oakland. But I love places like Detroit and Memphis, Milwaukee. I love cities that have some grit and character and civic pride. That's one of the things about those cities like that. Is people that are from there, man, they just live it. They're so into it. And I like cities that have dirt under their fingernails. I really like the song Detroit a lot. The next song after that is Rats in the Hallway. One of my favorite songs on this record, again, another sort of grim picture of urban life. I remember, as I've said before on this video already, sitting at home listening to this record so far removed from living in any sort of urban experience, just sort of daydreaming, almost fantasizing what it would be like to be, running the streets of Oakland, with these guys, just getting into all sorts of nonsense and all the craziness they must have seen and all the craziness, in their lyrics. And that's one of the great things about Rancid. It's one of the things I never get sick of when it comes to this band, whether it was this era, the earliest era, or all the way through, really, their catalog, is I think that Tim Armstrong is one of the greatest punk rock songwriters of all time. I think that he is such a great storyteller. I always picture this, especially as he gets older now. He's not an old guy, but as he gets older, I picture him sort of sitting on his front porch in his rocking chair with a bunch of young punk rockers sitting at his feet, telling these stories in really only a way that he can. I think he is truly one of the greatest, storytellers, really, in American songwriting. I love these songs. I love his style of songwriting. Another song, the next song after that is a song called Another Night. This might actually be my favorite song on the record. Matt Freeman does have a pretty prominent vocal role in this song, but it doesn't bother me as much as it sometimes does. But this song, of course, it references the running through the Oakland skyline, right at the beginning of the song. Anytime you mention Oakland, my ears are going to perk up. Like I said, Oakland is probably my favorite city, at least in the country. I believe I've read that this song is about that window of time in Tim Armstrong's life, after the demise of Operation Ivy and before the birth of Rancid, a time in his life that was pretty grim. According to all accounts, this song is very grim. The song is very dark. The song has a very kind of hopeless feel to it, but it's one of my favorite songs, if not my favorite song on the record. The next song after that is Animosity. To me, this is basically your basic, almost perfect anti-authoritarian punk rock anthem. Pretty straightforward, pretty self-explanatory, but incredibly well written, very angry. I really like the song Animosity. The next song after that is Out of My Mind. I think this song is about the depth and depravity, if you will, of Tim Armstrong's drug and alcohol use. And, like I said at the beginning of this video, at a certain point in time, he actually ended up homeless for a while in the streets of the East Bay. But again, I think that this song is sort of about, again, kind of that window in his life in between Operation Ivy and Rancid. The next song after that is Whirlwind. To me, this is about a song that is falling into about a city that is falling into decay. Later in this song, Tim Armstrong tells a story about seeing his dad get arrested in his front yard, and he talks about seeing it through a curtain of tears. Very, very cool. Well, not cool, but very sort of stark imagery in this song. I think this song is also sort of a little bit about the plight of the working class, even going back to the 1990s. And, this song also makes reference to his dad's alcoholism, something that would become a theme of other songs throughout Rancid's career. This is a very heavy song, in my opinion. Like I said, I think that the story in the song, the last two-thirds of the song, the story talking about his dad being arrested and how his dad, turned to the bottle in order to cope, is something that is, very, again, another trait in Tim Armstrong's songwriting, which was that he was always very, transparent. He was always honest. And again, he's just such a great storyteller. And this isn't necessarily, a happy-go-lucky story, but, a lot of times, if, at least around this era of Rancid's career, I don't necessarily think they were meant to be a happy band. The next song after that is Rejected, another great Matt Freeman bass intro. A little bit too much Matt Freeman on the vocals, at least for this one, and on this one as far as I'm concerned. But I do love the subject matter. I think that this song is about being an outcast. That's something I can certainly relate to, growing up in a small town as a sort of a throwaway kid in my high school, my general peer group. I think that was one of the things in my younger years that first appealed to me about this style of music and about this subculture, was that we were all sort of an island of misfit toys. That was something that kind of brought me into the fold. This is a song I love. I definitely can relate to a lot. I've said this in the past. My high school career, I was sort of lucky in the sense that, yes, I was a nerd, and I was definitely an outcast, but I wasn't somebody who was, necessarily, targeted. It's funny, this coming up this spring, or later this spring, is my 30th high school reunion. Something I do not plan on attending, by the way, but even if I did, I always joke that, nobody from my high school would even remember me, because I wasn't even, targeted. I was just sort of one of the guys in the background. The next song after that is a song called Injury. This song is okay. I would just say the thing that stands out most about this song is that it is probably one of the angriest songs in the entire Rancid catalog, but it's a song I do like. After that is a song called The Bottle. I mean, pretty self-explanatory there. This is another song with, in my opinion, a little bit too much of Matt Freeman on the vocals. Again, I don't mean that as any, form of disrespect. It's just, to me, his vocals have never really done it for me. This song in particular sounds fairly, kind of cartoonish, which, I hate to say, but I believe that. The next song after that is Holiday Sunrise. A song I think is okay. The last few songs on this record don't do as much for me as some of the songs towards the beginning of this record. After that is a song called Unwritten Rules. I think this song is a really cool message. I think this song is about the importance of music. I think this song is about, getting your message out at any cost. I do think it's also sort of about, the camaraderie within, at least the punk rock scene, maybe in the Bay Area in the 90s. And the last song on this record is a song called Get Out of My Way. Like I said, the last three songs before this, Trenches, Holiday Sunrise, and Unwritten Rules, I think they're okay. I think they're some of the weaker songs on the record, but Get Out of My Way is a great song, arguably one of my favorite songs on the record. So to me, I think this record at least ends on a little bit of a higher note. After that, the band on June 21st, 1994, they released their second record, Let's Go. This was a record that if I didn't buy it, right when it came out, it was not long after that. Like I said before this record came out, I was already a fan of the first record. As I mentioned before, this was the first tour I ever saw. I remember picking this CD up, not long after it came out. And the picture on the back of this CD, in particular, was something that just spoke to me. There was something about this photograph. And, like I said, this record came out. I was living, or at least when I bought this record, I was living in a town called Chico, California. I had just recently moved out of my parents' house. I was getting ready to start taking college classes. But this picture on the back of the band, of course, they're in Brett Reed's car. They got a couple of 40s going. To me, that was how I saw myself. That was, that picture pretty much epitomized the way I saw myself. And at this point in my life, I hadn't fully dedicated myself yet to the whole punk rock thing. But I remember seeing that picture, and it was like, oh my God, that these guys get it. Of course, this is the first record which features Lars Fredriksson on vocals and second guitar, and I gotta tell you, I think that makes the record better. I like this record better than the first record, and as annoying a human being as Lars Fredriksson is capable of being at times, I think his contribution to the band is huge, and I think especially on this record, coming out of the first record, you notice it a lot more. Now he's been in the band for 30 years, so you don't really think about that. Think about the first record where he isn't on it as much, unless you're actually listening to the first record. But I love his vocals, I love his guitar playing, and I think it benefits the band in the sense that you rely less on Matt Freeman's vocals. And like I said, I'm not sitting here trying to just beat this point to death, but I think that Lars Frederiksen is a million times better singer than Matt Freeman. I actually love Lars's voice. I love his guitar playing. I think it adds an element to the band. And now, like I said, 30 years later, you can't picture Rancid not being a four-piece. And really, of course, these records, I didn't mention it before, but these records, of course, feature original drummer Brett Reed, who I thought was an incredible drummer. I have no issues with the current drummer, Brandon, either. But to me, it's funny that Rancid is a band that over the years, they've only had one lineup change. And I think that is a testament to the brotherhood that these guys do have for each other. And I believe, according to everything I've read and heard, that even when Brett Reed left the band, it wasn't necessarily on bad terms. It was just an issue, I think, of him kind of being burnt out more than anything else. Like I said, this record came out on June 1st, 1994 on Epitaph Records, produced by Brett Gurwitz. I like this record better than the first one. Of the first two, this is definitely my favorite. Now, as we do the Rancid records on this channel, I'm going to do them in increments of 2 because there's just so much to talk about with each record. Now, neither of these records are necessarily my favorite Rancid record. I will announce which one it is when we get there, but I like this one better. I like the production better. It is a little bit more polished. It is a little bit cleaner, but I wouldn't say that it's poppy. It is catchier, and like I said, I do believe that Lars Frederiksen adds something positive to the band. I think that this is a better record. I think the songwriting is better. The first song, of course, is a song that was featured on 120 Minutes on MTV. There was a video for Nihilism. The song starts off by making reference to the neighborhood that Lars grew up in Campbell, Charmin Palms. It's funny, he talks about Campbell being kind of a white ghetto back in those days. It's hard to imagine anywhere in the South Bay, especially in San Jose or Campbell, being anything other than what it is now, which is basically, the hub of the Silicon Valley and just the mecca of, tech culture. Not suggesting that when Lars Frederiksen grew up there back in the 60s or 70s that it wasn't what he claims it is, but it's interesting to picture now when you go down to San Jose or Campbell. I've always sort of made the argument that San Jose isn't really part of the Bay Area. My wife, who grew up a lot in San Jose, would definitely argue with me. I've always said that San Jose is removed from the Bay Area because San Jose is more like Silicon Valley. Now, I don't know if you necessarily agree with that. But this song talks about being so far buried down in the bottle that really nothing else matters. Hence the term nihilism. Basically, your addiction is all that you have. I love this song. I love the video for this song. It was very much in the same vein as the Hyena video. It was self-made by the band DIY, produced and directed by Tim Armstrong. The second song on this record is a song called Radio. Arguably one of my favorite songs in the entire Rancid catalog. To me, the song is about finding the power of music, finding the meaning, of songs, and feeling that reality when, you realize that music, that feeling when you realize that music has, the power to save your life. And I'm somebody, I can tell you firsthand from personal experience that I believe that music has saved my life on multiple occasions. I think that's why I owe such a debt of gratitude to music. That's why on this channel, music is something that is always referred to or generally referred to in the positive. I try not to spend very much time, dwelling on music or artists that I don't like, because music to me is the ultimate positivity in my life as far as things go. Now, of course, I have a lot of personal relationships that mean everything to me, but in terms of, things, music to me has always been the most important thing in my life, and I think that's why I relate to this song so much. I remember the first time I heard the lyrics to this song, there was just something about it that really connected to me. The third song after that is a song called Sidekick. I always picture this song being about, Tim Armstrong being this sort of, like gritty urban superhero protecting, citizens from each other, from street crime, or even perhaps the police, in some cases. I like this song. It's sort of funny. It's sort of silly. I like how Tim refers to himself as a lesser-known character. The next song after that was, I think, one of the first songs to sort of break the band, Rancid. They had a video for the song called Salvation, a song that eventually started to get some relatively, some play on MTV in semi-heavy rotation, even before the Out Come the Wolves record came out. And this song makes reference to a neighborhood that is very notorious throughout the Bay Area, a neighborhood called Black Hawk. Now, Black Hawk, even for Bay Area standards, is very exclusive. I mean, if you ever met a kid from Black Hawk, you were getting ready to meet one of the worst human beings of all time. I mean, Black Hawk is the home of these, basically even back in the 1990s, these were like $5 million mansions. These were people that were so far out of touch with any sort of reality. I remember I had a girlfriend at the time. My first girlfriend I ever had at the time, her dad lived in a town called Walnut Creek. Now, Walnut Creek is fairly affluent. I would say it is an affluent suburb of Oakland, and he was very proud of the fact that he lived in Walnut Creek. Walnut Creek for him was sort of a passive-aggressive status drop, but he used to so much pine over people that lived in Black Hawk. That was his ultimate goal, was to someday be able to move to Black Hawk. In fact, the only two times in my life I ever drove through the Black Hawk neighborhood in the Bay Area was with him, because he would drive through there and he would just take you through and he would point out the houses he liked, which, these houses were just like ridiculous, honestly. And it was funny that he was somebody who that was his goal in life, was to be able to someday, move and live in this Black Hawk neighborhood, which, to most people I knew, at least back in the 90s in the Bay Area, was a place that was pretty despised, to be perfectly honest with you. And if you ever met a kid who grew up in Black Hawk, man, oh my God, it was nothing nice. After that, the next song is the title track, Let's Go. I think the song Let's Go is okay. I've always been sort of confused as to why it's the title track on this record. It's okay. I definitely think it's not necessarily one of the high points on this album for me. Maybe even one of the lower points. It's okay. Like I said, I don't understand why they chose this one to be, the title track. After that is a song called As One. I think the song is a great song. I think it's relatively self-explanatory. I do believe it's sort of a call to solidarity, especially among kids in the Bay Area punk scene. At least that's the way I sort of interpret it. After that is a song called Burn. I love this song as well. Again, another song that is lyrically pretty self-explanatory, talking about burning the American flag. We don't need no water, let the motherfucker burn, I think is pretty much sums up the attitude of this song. It's funny to think back. I mean, nowadays it doesn't seem like it's an issue, but I do remember when flag burning was like a divisive issue, a political issue in this country. It seems relatively silly now, but I do remember when that was like a big thing. Like, should people be allowed to burn the flag? I don't understand why it was such a big thing back in those days, but I do remember distinctly that was a political topic back then. The next song after that is the Ballad of Jimmy and Johnny. One of my favorite songs on the entire record. To me, I interpret this song as being sort of about the complexities within the skinhead scene in terms of all of the different sort of subcultures. Now, as I've mentioned before on this video and on this channel in the past, I grew up in a very small town, very far removed from any sort of urban experience. And I remember when I was a kid, to me, because of the way they were portrayed in the media and in movies and in television, to me, all skinheads were the bad guys. They were all the sort of racist skinheads. Now that, of course, is before I learned anything about the history and what it meant to be a sharp or a traditional skinhead. To me, as a kid, they were all sort of, bad guys. And I remember I used to spend my summers up in Oregon, and back in those days, Portland in particular had a pretty bad, like, white supremacist skinhead scene. And I remember even in high school going up there into Portland and seeing dudes that actually did have like swastikas and stuff on their jackets. I remember being like pretty scared of those guys. But once I discovered, what it actually meant to be a real skinhead, a sharp skinhead, or a traditional skinhead, then, I sort of began to understand it more. And of course, nowadays I'm a huge fan of, pretty much all skinhead music. I do remember, this reminds me of one night when I was living in the Bay Area back in the 1990s. We had a party at our apartment. Now, this was something that we didn't usually get in the habit of because we had some very uptight neighbors. And the first weekend that we lived in that apartment, we tried to have a party and it got shut down, and our neighbors pretty much hated us for the next year. So we tried to be, good neighbors after that, despite being sort of young and crazy. But it was not long before we were going to move out of that apartment. We thought, hey, what the hell, doesn't matter now, we'll have a party. And we had a bunch of people over. And this group of dudes showed up uninvited and unannounced, and it turned out that they were sort of Nazi skinheads. Now, in the 90s, you could find these dudes at shows running around from time to time. And eventually, they ended up getting kicked out of our party. And they came back about an hour later, and they threw beer bottles through the window of our apartment. We lived up on this second-floor apartment. And not long after they got kicked out, some beer bottles came flying in through the window. That was my most, as far as my personal interaction with those guys, that was really the only personal interaction I ever had. Of course, you could see those guys at shows periodically through around in the 1990s. There was out in east of Oakland and Berkeley, there's a county called Contra Costa County. And back in those days, Contra Costa County was sort of notorious for having a lot of these dudes hanging out there. The next song after that is a song called Gunshot. Another song that has Matt Freeman vocals, a song that I think is okay. Instrumentally, I like this song. Lyrically, vocally, I don't necessarily like this song. Side 1 ends with a song called I Am the One. To me, this song is sort of looking at suicide through kind of a religious perspective. And how it's sort of a no-win situation. If you attempt suicide and fail, the judgment that you're going to face by those from the the religious community, and of course, if you succeed, you're going to hell. So really, it's a no-win situation. But I think it's an interesting song. I don't know so much. I don't know, if Tim Armstrong grew up, in a super religious setting or not. But it is an interesting, I think, perspective on that. The next song after that is a song called "Gave It Away." The next two songs, "Gave It Away" and Ghetto Box, I think are okay. I think they're sort of lower points on the record, at least as far as I'm concerned. The next song after that is a song called Harry Bridges. I love this song. This is one of my favorite songs on the record. This song is about an American labor leader, first with the International Longshoremen's Association. Later, he helped form the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, which he led for 40 years. Several times he was prosecuted by the federal government for his labor organizing efforts. And during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was attempted on several occasions to deport him back to his native Australia. He eventually died I believe in the 1990s at the age of 90 or 88. The song after that is a song called Black and Blue, another song with Matt Freeman vocals. This song is okay. This song talks about sort of, breaking away from your hometown, or, you're never going back. It does remind me a little bit, like I said, of the town I grew up in. The next song after that is a song called St. Mary. One of my favorite songs on the entire record. This song is about a woman whose husband was killed by a police officer, and basically she goes out on the hunt to try to find him and gun him down. And I can tell you, personally speaking, that if anything were to ever happen to my wife in any sort of violent capacity, basically it's on. I'm going to go and I'm going to try and do everything I can, including what is described in this song. I've always not joked, because it's nothing to joke about, but if something were to happen to my wife, I would probably take my dogs to my in-laws, and I would basically plan on going out in a blaze of glory. I love this song. I feel like it's very relatable. If anything, like I said, if anything were ever to happen to my wife in a violent manner, it could be nothing nice, I'll tell you. I'm not even sure what I would do, honestly. I mean, it's easy to talk tough, but you can't even imagine putting myself in that position. The next song after that is Dope Sick Girl. Again, I think a relatively self-explanatory song, but again, as I talked about earlier, this song just shows off Tim Armstrong's just genius for storytelling and writing lyrics, in that sort of style. After that, there's a song called International Cover-Up. I think this is your basic anti-government punk rock anthem. I love this song. After that is a song called Solidarity. To me, the song is about losing somebody you love. I think specifically in this case to suicide, but I think it's losing somebody at just a unfairly young age. That's something that my wife and I have gone through over the past couple years without going into too much detail, and it's something that you really never quite get over all the way. My wife and I went through a loss a couple years ago, and it's something that neither one of us will ever, fully recover from, and the person was just painfully young, and it's so tragic. This is a very sad song. It's a very tragic song. After that is a song called Midnight. I think the song is okay, but again, Matt Freeman's bass work on this is just the jugs. After that is a song called Motorcycle Ride. I think the song is about a fatal motorcycle accident. It talks about a fifth of bourbon and a motorcycle ride. That's the way that I interpret the song. It's a pretty good song. I don't think it's necessarily one of the high points on the record. One thing I would say that this album does have in common with the first record is towards the last third of the record, there's a little bit of clunkage. Not saying that Motorcycle Ride is clunkage. To me, it's like a lesser song. The next song after that is a song called Name. Basically, the song is about the impersonalization of work. It reminds me of when I first worked during COVID. I had to change careers for a couple years because I have a job where I work very closely with the public, and for about a year I went to go work at an Amazon warehouse. And, there's so many people that work there, and the turnover is just so, insane all the time that basically you don't have a name. Managers are like, hey, you, get over here, do this, do that. And after about a year of working at Amazon, I decided to move up in that industry in case I was considering, making warehousing more of a career. And I started to work for a different company, which was definitely a step up in that industry. And I had this manager, and I don't know why he really sort of honed in on me, but he used to call me retard. That was my name to him. It was, hey, retard, get over here, retard. Hey, retard, do this, retard. And it was just all day, every day. And ironically, this guy was like basically illiterate. He was literally one of the dumbest people I've ever met in my entire life. But for me, to him, my name was retard. And it was like that for basically a year. Now, I'm not somebody who's going to make, a lot of complaints. I'm not somebody who, tries to be a wuss about this stuff. But it bothered me after a while. I'm not going to lie to you. And like I said, the guy was so dumb. The fact that he would call anybody a retard was quite ironic, my friends. Anyway, the song after that ends the record, which is a song called 7 Years Down. I think this is a really good song. Again, another song I think that discusses Tim's struggles with drug and alcohol abuse. I think it ends the record on a very solid note. Like I said, I would take this record over the first record if I had to choose of the two. And it's interesting if you go back, and like I said, I'll be doing these Rancid records in twos just because there's so many of them and there's so much to talk about on each record. But to me, these two records are really like an era of the band's career. This to me is like the first era of the band's career. And it's funny if you think back at this era of the band's career, especially listening to these records when they were new, it's hard to imagine as gritty and as, at the time, and I don't want to necessarily say that this is street punk, but as for me at the time, at least how street and gritty and urban these records felt. It's funny to think now that these guys are all multi-millionaires. This band has been going on for 30 years. I mean, certain members of this band are guys that you have to unfollow on social media because they've basically become name-dropping, self-congratulatory douches. The guy on Instagram who posts pictures like, look how cool my kids are. He's wearing a Motorhead shirt. But it's interesting to think that this band would go on to become, basically with their next record, Out Come the Wolves, would go on to become one of the bigger bands of the 1990s. Because I remember when these records came out, or when I was listening to them at the time, and I've been listening to them a lot this past week, trying to sit down and, write out some ideas about it. It's funny, because to me, these records at the time, they felt so gritty and so... this was not a band that was going to be around for 30 years, you know what I mean? This was not a band that was going to be on MTV and Saturday Night Live in heavy rotation. But anyway, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie. Be sure to check out your local record store. Check back every week for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, I'll talk to you then.